for coming along tonight, and it's a real pleasure for me to see a number of people in the audience I've known a very long time. I've structured my talk into three parts. First of all, I'll say a bit about who Bottomley was. Then I'll discuss two main periods in Bottomley's life. So the first part, the second part of my paper will cover his upbringing and its impact on his beliefs from his birth in 1860 up until about 1905, when he was elected to Parliament as a Liberal, indeed left Liberal, or use the term used at the time, radical MP. The third and final part will explore the last 4 years of his political life, which is Bottomley's second stint in Parliament between 1918 and 1922, and his relationship then with the right and with the far right. So first section, who was Bottomley? Horatio Bottomley had multiple careers, one in Parliament, one in the media, and one in business. In Parliament, he was the MP for South Hackney between 1905 and 1912, and again from 1918 to 1922. He was initially elected, as I've said, as a Liberal MP in 1905, though he had abandoned that party by about 1910, tried to defect to the Conservatives, but unsuccessfully. And from 1910 to 1912, he was effectively an independent, experimenting with creating a party of his own called the John Ball League. He was made bankrupt in 1912, after which he was forced to stand down for Parliament. He was then re-elected in 1918, again as an independent. And at the height of his power in his second stint in Parliament, he had the support of about 10 or 12 MPs, a very loose party caucus of independents. Several of them were elected as anti-waste MPs, and that's a label I'll explain in due course. Now, in terms of this part of his life, Bottomley's political career, that has effectively been forgotten, and I think for a couple of reasons. One is that his disgrace in business in 1922 was so cataclysmic that it simply overwhelmed every other part of his life story. Another reason is he was trying to create a party outside the Conservatives and to their right, but not fascist. And I think future generations since then, that includes, sort of people my age, people younger than me, have found and find it incredibly difficult to imagine what that could mean. Our sense of the far right has been so swallowed up by the memory of Hitler and of Mussolini. Until recently, we couldn't imagine what it would mean for there to be a group of people outside the Conservatives, serious about attacking them on their right, and yet falling short of doing what the interwar fascists did, which was to use political violence repeatedly against their enemies, of course, racial violence too. That's Bottomley's political career in a nutshell. As for his press career, Bottomley founded John Ball magazine, building it to the point where between 1914 and 1918, they had a regular paid sale of between 1 and 2 million copies per issue. Now, I really do want to emphasize, this is, in the time, an extraordinary success, and by any British standards, it's an extraordinary success. If you think today, the best-selling news weeklies in Britain today sell about 250,000 copies a week, and quite a lot of that sale is an international sale. John Ball's selling 10 times as many copies as that. It was a populist magazine, by which I mean it spoke continuously about the people, while excluding from the ranks of the people all sorts of enemies who might be the sorts of people that a group of socialist historians would be most interested in. So trade unionists weren't part of the people. Lesbians and gay men were excluded, suffragettes, campaigners for Irish independence. When miners struck during the First World War, John Ball insisted they should be arrested, treated as deserters, and punished according to martial law. I think now's probably a good time. Steve, could you put up that image I sent you? So you'll see just coming up in a second. I've asked, here we go. You'll see there an image of Bottomley doing one of his sort of classic middle of the First World War, probably recruitment meetings. And this is from this period where John Ball was standing, trying to present itself as kind of the most patriotic voice of the age, and Horatio Bottomley as the incarnation of all his magazine stood for. Bottomley's most important campaign was one encouraging hatred against German civilians living in Britain. Of them, Bottomley wrote, "You cannot naturalize an unnatural beast, a human abortion, a hellish freak, but you can exterminate it." As for German soldiers, he wrote, "I'd put into the field an army of Zulus and Basutos and other native and half-civilized tribes and let them run amok in the enemy's ranks, I'd give them all the asphyxiating gas they wanted. Within days of that peace, riots were broken out against German civilians living in Britain. Bankers gathered wearing top hats on the steps at the stock exchange to pass a motion no Germans must be left in the city. And popular crowds attacked the houses of those suspected of harbouring Germans. Steve, that's probably a good point to take it off, actually. I think it's, people saw it a bit. This part of Bottomley's career survives in public memory better than his time as an MP, but only a little better. And I think it survives essentially because John Ball magazine outlasted him by about 40 years. Julius Elias, a 24-year-old owner of a small printing business when he met Bottomley in 1905, became his publisher, switched on Bottomley's defeat to the Daily Herald and took over running that, and was made a Labour peer in 1946. John Ball magazine itself closed in 1964. So there's a sort of 40-year history of that magazine beyond Bottomley. I think that kept him to some extent in people's minds because of the existence of that and because of his association with it. As for business, Bottomley was known in the press as a company promoter. In the early 1890s, he had a plan to amalgamate the printing and media industries within a single business called the Hansard Union. That failed in 1893, leading to a first fraud trial. From then until 1905, he was promoting Australian mining businesses. In around 1905, Bottomley met a fellow crook and supposedly company promoter Ernest Tora Hooley, after which, for several years, as far as we can see, Bottomley essentially gave up on company promoting and worked instead by a method which was a form of really barely concealed theft. Essentially what he would do is he'd hang around restaurants and other places where he might meet other very rich people, prey on young members of that class, persuade them to just give him, and sometimes elderly members of that class, persuade them to just give him tens of thousands of pounds in return for what turned out to be essentially bogus shares in non-existent companies. This tactic worked in terms of delivering a lot of money to him, but it was incredibly risky, not least because he's an MP. And what happens then is there's just a series of court cases, some dozens of them in a period of 4 or 5 years. And although Bottomley wins very many of them, often by quite dishonest tactics, essentially people bring about his bankruptcy in 1912 and his first departure from Parliament. Between 1918 and 1922, while Bottomley was back in the Commons, his major project was something called a Victory Bond Club. The idea was that subscribers would buy shares which were supposedly tied to a fifth of the government's victory bonds, official victory bonds scheme. They'd buy shares in Bottomley's club for £1, which supposedly would mirror the value of the official government bonds. Through them, Bottomley took around £1.1 million in club membership fees, deposited around 2/3 of it in his private bank account, and certainly none of that then made its way back to the subscribers, paid debts to his horse trainer, tame MPs, mistresses, and so on. Bottomley was tried in 1922, convicted and sentenced to 7 years imprisonment. And I think insofar as Bottomley is still remembered by people, it's really just for this trial, which becomes a slightly decontextualized event in 1922, separated from the rest of his career. It becomes, in effect, one of those great rogues of history, the sorts of name you might come across in a collection of true crime stories or a shorthand for the corruption of Edwardian England. Now that's sort of my autobiography of Bottomley for people who don't know his life. In the rest of the paper, I'll focus on his politics, first on his origins in the first half of his political life, and then really his destination where he gets to in those last 4 years in Parliament. So coming now to Bottomley's politics from about 1860 to 1905. In all previous biographies of Bottomley, 2 key details are mentioned, but very much in passing. People sort of rush through them without really thinking what they tell you. We learn that his mother, Elizabeth, was a secularist, as was his uncle, George Holyoake. And those details are used as props to get at what the writers really want to talk about, which is a sort of juicy piece of gossip encouraged by Bottomley himself in later life, that he may have had a secret parentage with either or both of Charles Bradlaugh and Annie Besant having perhaps been his real parents. Now, I say, of the secret parentage, the more I've thought about it, the more I'm convinced it's absolutely bogus. For one thing, Besant and Bradlaugh didn't even meet until Bottomley was 14, so there's no way that they were both his parents. Moreover, Bottomley kept the story secret until Bradlaugh was long dead, so there's no chance for the old man to contradict him. The story caused distress to surviving members of Bradlaugh's family. About the one fact which actually supports it is if you look at photographs of Bottomley, and I've just shown you one, well, like Bradlaugh, he had a large fleshy face. The difficulty is, of course, we know that he and Bradlaugh had relatively similar faces, but we don't know what the father named on Bottomley's birth certificate, a former shipwright turned tailor, William Bottomley, looked like. And without his picture, we can't make any meaningful comparison with Bradlaugh. And in any event, Bottomley and Bradlaugh may have had similar faces. There were lots of other ways in which they were physically very different. Bottomley was as short as Bradlaugh was tall. So if we sort of ignore that, we focus on the parents in a bit more detail. Some new scraps of information have emerged about Horatio's mother, Elizabeth Bottomley, who was indeed a secularist. Stories have survived of her attending Bradlaugh's talks at the Islington Hall of Science, and that tradition is corroborated, I'd say, by several mentions of EH, because she's Elizabeth Holyoake at this point, in the secularist press. A donation in that name of 5 shillings was made on the launch of George Jacob Holyoake's newspaper, The Reasoner, and I think we can conclude that was probably given by Elizabeth. She was then 14 and still living in Birmingham with her parents. 2 decades later, Horatio's birth was noted with approval in his uncle George Jacob Holyoake's engagement diary. And of course, by this point, Holyoake's been a leading figure in the Chartist movement, an early founder of secularism, and so on. There was even an article written in The Reasoner, published a few weeks before Horatio's birth, a friendly review of Samuel Smiles' self-help, which I think can plausibly be attributed to his mother, again, relying just on the sort of initials of the person who signed it. Understanding that Elizabeth Bottomley was an active secularist and her brother George Jacob Holyoake, the founder of that movement, helps, I think, to explain the earliest years of Horatio Bottomley's political engagement. He was a radical liberal and a contributor to the secularist paper, The National Reformer. He helped out his teenage years by sub-editing that newspaper. And in 1876, when Bottomley was just 16, he attended lectures delivered by the English positivist and recent supporter of the Paris Commune, Professor Beazley. The contributor to the National Reformer, HB, which I believe we can say must be Bottomley, summarises Beazley's talk perfectly diligently. At its top, secularism was a family business. Holyoake had been Bradlaugh's mentor. Another Holyoake, George Jacob, and Elizabeth's brother Austin, was Bradlaugh's election agent. By the 1880s, secularists could afford, in effect, just 3 full-time workers, and they're all people bound by intense, close friendships: Bradlaugh, Annie Besant, and Besant's new lover, Edward Aveling. It may well be that Horatio Bottomley even hoped to be the heir to the family business, but if so, he absolutely flunked his audition. Young Bottomley will turn out to be a bad man, Bradlaugh is supposed to have said to Holyoake. While the secularists spurned Bottomley, he continued to idealise them for a long time afterwards, even for decades afterwards. The best way to understand his career, I'd say, between about 1880, when he's 20, and 1905, and gets a seat in Parliament, is of a series of attempts to persuade the secularists, or perhaps just himself, that he was carrying on the family tradition. So if you just take a really simple first example, in 1882, when he's just 22 years old, Bottomley founds the first newspaper, the Hackney Hansard. I think it's plausible to say, without having been brought up, surrounded by radical journalists, without having been trained as a sub-editor and so on, there's no way that someone aged just 22 with no capital, no training set, would have felt that it was possible to found their own newspaper. He believed he could do so because he was surrounded by people who'd done that. He was employing the skills he'd learned from his uncle and from Bradlaugh. In 1887, just 27 years old, Bottomley was selected as a Liberal candidate for the first time for Hornsey, after which he was chosen as a candidate for North Islington, which is then, as today, a radical constituency. He publicly supported temperance and Irish Home Rule. And again, I don't think it's possible to understand that happening without seeing this is sort of part of the echoes of Bradlaugh's victory in Northampton and the debate of whether Bradlaugh could sit as an atheist. Bradlaugh's won his seat in Parliament. That creates the conditions under which Bottomley, a man in his 20s, is sort of fast-tracked towards eminently winnable Liberal seats. In 1888 to 1889, Bottomley becomes the chairman of the Financial Times, and he used the paper to report speeches delivered by his favourite politicians, principally Bradlaugh. Elected in 1905 as an MP, one of Bottomley's first acts was to deliver a speech to the Bradlaugh Fellowship, recalling the bitter days of Bradlaugh's isolation before he'd been vindicated by his ultimate victory over the Oaths issue. Bottomley wrote, "Wasn't he a dangerous and vulgar agitator, a man who knew no God, a Republican who dared to impeach the House of Brunswick?" And Bottomley there is very plainly saying, look at Bradlaugh, he was my inspiration, all these heroic things that he did, I'll follow in his routes, or I'll follow the path he took. Now, occasionally it's been argued that the great mistake made by the left between about 1880 and 1910 was to encourage the breakup of the Liberal coalition. Those with long memories may recall Tony Blair arguing that, for example, during the heyday of New Labour, and others have made the same point independently. The argument goes that in Victorian politics, there was only ever a single party on the left, the Liberals, and the right only had one party too, the Conservatives. The left fractured, the right didn't. And this is said to be why the Conservatives kept winning elections ever since. We fractured, they didn't. But it's worth seeing this period through the eyes of workers and trade unionists. How much were they actually getting from the supposed presence in politics, the supposed assistance of a supposed radical like Bottomley? I'll just give sort of two examples to suggest that workers and trade unionists weren't getting very much from him. For example, in 1888, when he's the chairman of the Financial Times and still very much a self-declared radical, Bottomley's there when Annie Besant, who has all sorts of family ties to, etc., is taking part in precipitating or supporting the match girl strike. Clearly, Bottomley knows this is going on and could have supported her, and that would be entirely consistent with his professed politics. Instead, he refused to give the match girls his support, insisting that the real victims of the strike weren't the workers with their low pay or their fussy jaws, but the employers. Bosses in London wanted to pay more. What was holding them back were market conditions. Crucially, he said, business rivalry from match producers in Sweden, where wood cost almost nothing. Don't blame the bosses for the strike. Don't, he said, in effect, don't put your hopes in the workers. You can see a very similar thing going on between about 1900, when Bottomley's become the Liberal prospective parliamentary candidate for South Hackney, and he's going to be the Liberal candidate. He hasn't been elected yet, but that's clearly going to happen. And there's more and more conflict between him and the local trades council in Hackney. Trade unionists call Bottomley an unscrupulous company promoter, which he was, and a city swindler, which in retrospect sounds pretty true as well. In return, Bottomley threatened the gas workers and General Labourers Union, and indeed Hackney Trades Council, with libel actions. One of his letters reads, "Your action leaves me no alternative but either to apply for an immediate order for a criminal prosecution or to oppose a writ against you for damages." I'd say that Bottomley's stance, there's one party on the left, it's the Liberals, they're the workers, we don't owe you anything. That's typical, frankly, of a whole long period of British politics. The left deserts Liberals because it feels to people on the left, trade unionists and other, as if the Liberals don't offer them anything. They expect a sort of one-way ticket, support and nothing back. So that takes me now to sort of the third and final section of mine, which is really just looking at Bottomley's politics between about 1918 and 1922. There are various reasons why Bottomley moves to the far right. One is that he failed as Liberal MP between 1905 and 1912. His strategy was to be such a loose cannon that the party had no option but to offer him a prize ministerial job in order to stop him from repeatedly rebelling. But the Liberal Party was sitting on a shrinking parliamentary majority, it lost seats in 1910, and it already possessed external factions, the Irish and Labour causes. spent time sensibly trying to woo them rather than trying to win back this loose cannon of an MP. Bottomley's magazine, John Bull, meanwhile, was such a commercial success, and its editorial line so solidly anti-liberal, the stakes were too high for the party for it to make it an easy job of winning him back. Moreover, in this period, when new people were breaking with Parliament in around 1910, and Bottomley's by no means only one of them, quite solidly they break with parliamentary politics and move to the right. So, for example, Hilaire Belloc is a Liberal MP at much the same time, comes out of Parliament at the same moment. His book, The Party System, denounces the Liberals and the Tories as like, says the consent Parliament's all washed up. And it's almost indistinguishable from the sorts of things which Bottomley is saying in the same period in John Bull. The 1914-18 war fixed Bottomley's new right-wing politics in stone. Initially anti-Serb, Bottomley realised that the war would be an opportunity to undo the stain of his bankruptcy and help him get back into Parliament. He therefore switched sides, taking a pro-Serb and anti-Austrian line. After that, we're not penning articles, attacking German civilians or strikers. He was delivering lectures, 300 of them all together, and all paid, calling other men to volunteer and risk their lives in the war. From 1914 onwards, the trend of his politics was outside and against democracy. Under what his ideal was now a business government, Parliament he described as played out, be abolished in favour of military rule. All his allies were on the far right. In 1916, Bottomley backed Noel Pempton Billing with his claim that an unseen hand, in other words, Jews, were controlling the Labour Party and the unions. And his idea that the Black Book held the names of 47,000 gay men and women, a cult of the clitoris, who had been blackmailed into giving covert support to the German war effort. Another of Bottomley's friends was George McGill, founder of Economic League, with again with lurid fancies of Jews in every secret society, Jewish anarchists and communists especially. In 1918, McGill and Bottomley founded the People's League to lead the anti-communist campaign against the left, which they thought the Conservatives had abandoned. Where Bottomley's politics were taking him was shown by the anti-waste campaign of 1919 to 1921, during which 7 elections were won by anti-waste, in other words, pro-austerity candidates, opposed to then Liberal Conservative coalition government. So the context of the campaign is the resumption of ordinary politics after the end of the 1914-18 war, a time when the composition of the cabinet hadn't changed since the war. Most right-wing voters hated Lloyd George, they despised his politics, seeing him as the inventor of the state pension, national insurance, rent controls, and all sorts of other things which were bad for the middle classes. In January 1920, a pro-Bottomley independent was elected at Wrekin. The following January, at a by-election at Dover, an anti-waste candidate won with the support of Bottomley and the press baron Lord Rothermere. At the campaign's height, there were 10 anti-waste independents, generals and company directors sitting in the House of Commons. Growing numbers of conservative associations announced their support for the broad thrust of the anti-waste campaign, while others, among them a young Oswald Mosley, joined campaigns intended to copy it, including conservative-sponsored People's League for Economy. By spring 21, though, Rothermere and Bottomley, the two pioneers of this new strand of militant conservatism, were at odds. Rothermere believed an attack on social reforms would help crystallise middle-class politics around a shared distrust of the poor. If you could make the Conservatives the sole anti-socialist party, he thought they'd win every election. By contrast, Bottomley's aim was not a reinvigorated conservatism. He didn't want a Britain where Conservatives and Labour alternated in government, even if the former held power for longer. Unlike Rothermere, he wanted to see something more. In other words, the left MPs in jail. Anti-waste was ostensibly a movement united around a single cause of shrinking the state and making cuts. But the longer Bottomley was involved with anti-waste, the more he quibbled with its basic premise. He wanted the army expanded, not cut. He liked to imagine British power extending all around the globe. He tended to downplay what he called the cutting down of pensions, which he reasoned would alienate as many people as it attracted. His vision of a growing far right was closer to the experiments in right-wing politics emerging in Germany, Italy, and Spain. In the incipient split between Bottomley and Rothermere, Bottomley had a keener sense of direction politics was heading. Even in Britain, the Conservative Party would grow in the 1920s and 1930s by exploiting other causes than Rothermere's, or at least other causes than the one espoused by Rothermere at this point, because obviously Rothermere has his own trajectory 10 years later. But the Conservatives would win through an anti-communist culture war, as Noviev letter, then from 1932 by promising an imperial tariff, which would enable the party to link welfare benefits to the maintenance of the empire. It would win by promising more, not by cutting. Really then, just to sum up, Horatio Bottomley's fraud conviction in 1922 brought an end to his political career. During his trial, the central issue was whether he'd been loyal to the soldiers who'd volunteered for the army, then wagered their savings on him. He told the jury, "I hope to satisfy you, if they were the last words to pass my lips, that I am incapable of robbing an ex-soldier." But of course, Bottomley wasn't believed. Sentencing him, Mr. Justice Salter said, "The crime is aggravated by your high position," in other words, by being an MP, "by the number and poverty of your victims, by the trust which they repose in you and you abused." In other words, it's the same thing. You got all these soldiers to put their money in your bonds and you stole from them. One way to read Bottomley's life is as a play on an old theme, that patriotism really is the last refuge of the scoundrel. The other way to see it, and I'll argue in my book, is as an illustration of a different piece of political wisdom, one initially developed by the 1880s left, that liberalism and radicalism were two exhausted traditions, and that nothing good would come from any attempt to continue them beyond the natural life history. I suppose I'm saying, to put that another way, is that there are more continuities between Bottomley, the radical, and therefore with Bradlaugh, than from there to the later Bottomley than the Bradlaugh tradition would ever acknowledge. But there is a sense in which that tradition had been exhausted, and any attempt to carry it on would have ended badly. It may not have ended as badly as Bottomley did, but any attempt to carry it on would not have answered the problems which increasing number of people were articulating as the 20th century wore on.
Thanks very much, David. Very interesting presentation, and I think it's quite a good summary of what's in the book. Time for questions. We've got lots of time because David's done that in half an hour. If you put your hands up or wave at me on the camera, but while I'm waiting, if I can just ask David a question to get this going. Was Bottomley totally unprincipled? I mean, I'm asking that because although he changed his political position, he doesn't seem to have had any basic principles in his radical stroke liberal period, being very much kind of journalist and scandalmonger. And bluntly, in his time in Parliament as a Liberal MP, he doesn't seem to have done anything useful or campaigned positively for anything at all. So was he just an opportunist? And the other half of the question really is, in moving to the right, I mean, he was more of an extreme patriot and anti-German, which would appear to be for opportunist reasons, and really only gets involved in kind of organized far-right politics from 1918 onwards, just really for a couple of years.
Sorry, I'm not totally sure I got the second half of that. What the point was? Could you just rephrase that slightly?
Well, I mean, he doesn't. I mean, his involvement in right-wing politics does seem to have been only in that very brief period from 1918 to 1920, maybe 21. And even then, he's involved in all these court cases. So, I mean, his ability to politically organize actually seems relatively limited. But as I say, it does seem to be sort of almost a trajectory of opportunism rather than actually a principle. Okay, well, look,
firstly, I think there's more continuity between the pre-1914 Bottomley than I was able to give a flavour of in my talk. If you think about the John Ball League, which is going from 1910 to 1912, you know, the things it's doing then in terms of calling for business government, the suppression of Parliament, in terms of the sort of, some of the small examples I give in the book are, you know, rival candidates speaking, and then Bottomley, you know, disrupting them to the point that it's certainly bordering on political violence against his opponents. So I think there's a trajectory there that predates 1914. And again, I think I actually think there's probably sort of 3 bits of Bottomley being on the far right. There's a bit from 1910 to 1912. There's stuff that he's doing in the war, and there's stuff that he's doing anti-war. And they all have continuity between them, but there's also gaps between them. Like, he's not really doing anything politically between 1912 and 1914. You know, again, I mean, there's an opportunism about his turn to the far right. I mean, if you look at his wartime turn to the far right, you often get the feeling that really it's just about Bottomley getting the best job he can. And that's the overwhelming thing. And that's a bit of a break. So I think there's breaks between it, but I also think there's a great deal of continuity. And I don't like the term opportunist. I mean, I think generally, as someone who's thought about the far right in lots of different moments, it seems to me that it's more an example of just someone going, where's history going to take me? And there are quite a lot of people who go into the far right at different points in the 20s and 30s, who you really wouldn't have expected known the rest of their life, but they make that conscious decision and they see where it takes them. I feel with Bottomley, that, you know, there's not a very big difference between Bottomley and Mussolini. If you could turn off Mussolini's career in 1915 and you only had 1914 to go by, or some of the people who go to fascism in the Second World War. And we know sometimes it's actually been perfectly inspiring and wonderful people on the left. And you go, how on earth did that happen? But it's just they let history lead them. I think there's an element of that with Bottomley. But I think the other thing with Bottomley that I really would emphasize is, at least in his own head, he's loyal. He's not loyal in the way that people on the left are to ideas, but in his head, he's loyal to people. And you see little traces of him being led by that, whether that's towards the far right or sometimes in other more complex directions. And just to give a small example, which I don't make of much in the book, I'm pretty sure that one of Bottomley's small campaigns in the 1918 to 1922 period is in Parliament, there's a bill to take away the death penalty as a punishment for deserters. Now, Bottomley actually sides with that campaign, and it's completely out of kilter with everything else he's doing at the time. But I can't help but feel that the continuity which explains it is in his head. All these soldiers have supported him, and he kind of wants to do something back to them. And I think that quite a lot of the time you see with Bottomley that sense that it's a loyalty to people rather than loyalty to ideas or to programs. And I think there's something similar going on in terms of Bottomley's long radical period. He's immensely loyal to Bradlaugh, but when you try and ask him to say why, it all vanishes. But he is actually loyal to Bradlaugh, even if it doesn't lead to very much.